Hello, everyone. I am John Fanning, the treasurer of GHBER. I am also the vice president of Integrity Risk, who is this year's corporate sponsor. Thank you for taking the time to join the GHBER Summer Workshop. We are doing this virtually, and I want to cover a few housekeeping items to get us off to a good start. Number one is attendees should be muted. So we'll make this an interactive session. There will be Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A link. You can go in there and ask your questions, and we will save those up till the end unless the presenter decides to jump in and answer one early. Otherwise, we've got some time reserved at the end. This is going to be recorded, and the links to the website will also with the materials provided by the speaker will be available to the members on the GHBER website. With that, we will go ahead and get started. I will hand this off to Vanessa Rossi, our current president of the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable, and she will get us started and discuss a few additional items. Vanessa?
Great, thank you, John.
Thank you.
As John said, I'm this year's president of GHBER. Thank you everyone for joining day 2 of our summer workshop. I hope you were able to join yesterday and can choose some webinars for the rest of the week as well. We do appreciate everyone's attendance. But before I let Joya Williams kick off our webinar this morning and explain the topic and introduce our speaker, I wanted to say a few words about our sponsor, Integrity Risk International. Integrity Risk is a provider of risk management services, including global enhanced due diligence services accompanied by a comprehensive due diligence online portal and supported by a database aggregator and other sophisticated technology tools. Integrity Risk also provides services related to beneficial ownership compliance, wealth intelligence, social media diligence, impact investing, and sustainability diligence. They also provide compliance advisory services in several areas, including anti-bribery and corruption, and anti-money laundering. Finally, Integrity performs asset inquiries, executive background checks, monitorships, and various safety and security services. As you can see, they're a comprehensive compliance services provider, and we appreciate them sponsoring our webinar this week. Now, Joya will tell you about today's topic and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Vanessa. Today's topic excuse me, is about current cybersecurity challenges. And we are so pleased to have with us Matt Kelly. Matt Kelly is the editor and CEO of RadicalCompliance.com, which is a blog and newsletter that follows corporate governance risk compliance issues at large corporations. It includes compliance job reports, a weekly update on compliance professionals moving around the industry. He also speaks on compliance, governance, and risk topics frequently. Matt was named a rising star of corporate governance by Milstein Center for Corporate Governance in 2008. He was also named to Ethisphere's most influential in business ethics list, excuse me, in 2011 and 2013. In 2018, Matt won a Reader's Choice Award for JD Super as one of the top 10 authors on corporate compliance. Matt was previously an editor of Compliance Week, a newsletter on corporate compliance from 2006, through 2015. He currently lives in Boston, Massachusetts. Now I will turn it over to Matt Kelly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joya, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am here to talk about cybersecurity. So let me see if I can share my screen and call up the slides I would like to go through today, because we have a lot to cover. Let's see. So you should see this now here, that we are here to talk about cybersecurity. And specifically, I want to talk a bit about some of the new regulations coming down from the federal government, because that is happening. And then also I want to talk a bit about how those regulations are really going to impact your company and how it does business, specifically with your supply chain, with your vendors, all of your suppliers, because that is a big risk for corporate cybersecurity these days. Now, I have modified this talk today from a previous version I've given more for internal auditors and internal control experts and procurement officers. So from time to time, you might see references to lingo that is not something you might usually see if you work in corporate legal departments or corporate compliance. But that's actually part of, I think, the bigger point is that what is coming down the road for cybersecurity is going to really be a whole company response, that this is not going to be a security department's task where you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to be a task that just compliance does, where you have to worry about all of it. It is going to be something that I think is transformational, that a whole lot of departments within your business are going to need to think through, how do we handle this very life or death existential issue for most businesses today, most large businesses, and how could you and the compliance or legal team work well with those in audit or IT security or procurement and vice versa. That tends to be how I like to talk about these issues. So as I said, we got a lot to go on, a lot to cover here. And so I'll start moving on. Joya already gave a very gracious introduction to me, so I won't elaborate too much here. Just suffice to say, in one form or another, I have been writing about corporate ethics, corporate compliance, good corporate compliance programs, public policy for the better part of 20 years. I started right after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2003. And I always say I'm very lucky to have started writing about these issues when I did, since in 2003, I didn't know all that much about corporate compliance, but then neither did anybody else, because we had just pretty much invented enforcement of the FCPA at a large scale, and cybersecurity and corporate accounting and everything else. So I also like to say that I do love talking about these issues. I think the problems that you all deal with are this Rubik's Cube of one part, what is the law? One part, what is the technology we're going to use to make our compliance program run? What is organizational behavior? It's another part, public policy, internal office politics. And if you twist the cube one way, you're going to solve one problem, but create another. And what you have to grapple with is endlessly fascinating. So anytime you do want to shoot the breeze about this, you can always find me online at my website. You can sign up for my newsletter if you'd like. But even if you don't, I'm not going to take it personally. If you drop me an email or give me a phone call, I will, once you get me wound up, I will talk about this stuff all day long. I'm not going to do that today. Joya specifically said I have until about 11:45 when she's going to ring the bell, and we're going to move on to Q&A. So it's only going to be about an hour. But here is what I would like to cover today. A couple of different big themes. First, I'd like to talk a bit about what regulators are actually saying about cybersecurity these days, because they have been saying a lot, especially the Defense Department. So if you are a defense contractor, this applies to you. Most recently, we have the White House issued an executive order on cybersecurity in the federal government. So if you are just a broad government contractor, this applies to you. We are going to talk a bit about the SolarWinds attack that happened last year against the federal government and also swept up a lot of large companies. So if you work for a large company, this applies to you. And there's a theme here, is that there's very little that very few organizations these days are not going to be affected by what is happening with cybersecurity. I do also, as you can see in that third bullet point, I do have some ideas on how you can start to approach cybersecurity at a program level. There is a government agency, if you have ever heard of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are the ones who put out cybersecurity standards that a lot of regulators are pointing to now to say, you company who is going to be working with the federal government, you're going to need to meet these standards from NIST for good cybersecurity before we'll give you a contract. So we can talk a bit about what NIST has offered. And then we can also maybe talk a bit about what some of the other parts of your business are doing for cybersecurity, because you will have to work very closely with IT security as a function, internal audit as a function. If you have a procurement team, they're going to get pulled into this. And yes, the compliance team is also, I think, going to be part of what's going on. So we can talk about how all of that fits together. And then if we do have time for Q&A, I am all for questions. So by all means, if one comes to you, please insert it in the question box and we'll get to that when we can. So without any further delay then, let's start with what the regulators are saying. As I said, we have a lot of messages from regulators across pretty much the whole of the Biden administration. And this is also, I should add, this is the recent stuff, not to be confused with the existing cybersecurity rules or privacy laws that have been proliferating at the state level or in Europe with the GDPR. You've had that for a long time. And I know that many of you working in privacy or cybersecurity are probably already a bit exasperated with all of the regulatory obligations that have already come down. Now we're going to get to the new stuff that is piling on for various reasons. I think probably most important for people here today to pay attention to is the Biden administration's executive order issued on May 12th. That is going to affect government contractors broadly, and especially IT service vendors or cloud-based providers of technology services. If you want to bid on government contracts, that is going to hit you. The May 12th order was timed and in response to or hit the news the same time as that Colonial Pipelines ransomware attack that happened late April, early May. But actually, if you look at the order, and we will momentarily, it's much more related to or caused by the SolarWinds attack that happened last year against the federal government. And we'll talk about why that is as well. But beyond the Biden White House executive order, another big cybersecurity thing that had already been in motion was for defense contractors. This is called CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. That is a new standard for cybersecurity that defense contractors are going to have to start meeting. It is already coming into place for the largest defense contractors, the prime contractors. But there's going to be a 5-year phase-in period for any business that bids on defense contracts or is part of the defense industrial base because you are a subcontractor for Raytheon or Boeing or Huntington Ingalls, the shipbuilding guys over in Virginia, or if you're a subcontractor, if you're somewhere in the defense industrial base, which is 300,000 businesses in the United States, you will all wind up within the CMMC orbit by 2026. We have a 5-year window for everybody to get on that cybersecurity train. Now, in addition, here's our third bullet point, NIST that I had mentioned. NIST has published a standard that is a new version of a pre-existing cybersecurity standard that had been meant for government contractors. It has been superseded by another one, and we'll talk about all that. But their new standard, 800-53, they deliberately wrote it as this is good cybersecurity practices for any business at all. Government contractor, private business, nonprofit institution, healthcare, higher ed, you name it. If your business has a pulse, we at NIST, we recommend that you follow 853. That also came out just a couple of months ago. Now I include the CISA agency, which is, I think, the Cybersecurity or Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. CISA just published new rules for disclosure of ransomware attacks, specifically for pipelines, because of the Colonial Pipeline attack, which jolted CISA and everybody else. CISA is the one that issues cybersecurity compliance obligations specifically for critical infrastructure. So if you're in pipelines, if you're in telecom, if you're in financial services, if you're in probably a couple of other big industries, power generation and whatnot, CISA is another regulator you have, and they are quite attuned to the threats that are coming, especially driven by ransomware these days. And then lastly, if you are a publicly traded company, We have the Securities and Exchange Commission, who kind of shows up at the end of the party. You've already had your cybersecurity disaster. If you have not disclosed that disaster to your investors in a timely form, in a timely manner, you have a disclosure violation. And will the SEC then slap an extra fine on you after you've already had your cybersecurity breach and then you didn't disclose it to investors, and now boom, here's the SEC tacking on insult after injury, I suppose. They have done this several times, and in fact, just fined a company, a title insurance firm. They fined them just last week for having a cybersecurity breach, which they did not fix in a timely manner and then did not disclose to investors in a timely manner. So state regulators in New York fined this firm for failing to catch the breach, and then the SEC tacked on an extra $500,000 fine for not telling people that they had messed it up in a timely manner until it wound up in the news. So you can see there's a host of stuff going on with regulators from all different directions are coming to pile on the compliance obligations that businesses have. So here are the key themes of what they're trying to bring about right now. And by they, who are they trying to bring about? It's really the Biden administration overall. They want to pay much more attention to strong cybersecurity throughout your whole software supply chain. You have bought technology or a service from somebody else, and then they got infected, but you never did your due diligence on them, so they got attacked, and then the attack actually filtered through to you, and you're providing services to the federal government, so now the attackers are using you to reach the federal government. That's the sort of chain of events that regulators are trying to snap. So you're going to see a lot more pressure to pay attention to who are these vendors we're working with and how do we know their cybersecurity posture. This is not new. Any of you who might have been hacked by Target 7 years ago, and that includes me, where I had to get a new Target card. Target had a massive consumer privacy breach in 2014 caused by poor oversight of its HVAC vendor. That they were hacked, and then the HVAC vendor was wired into Target's payment system, and so the hackers went through the vendor to Target, through the payment system, to the little point of sale credit card machines that are on the registers, and that's how hackers stole more than 100 million personal records of US consumers in 2014. So this is not a new idea, but it is a enhanced pain right now because of ransomware, because the feds are getting involved and they're now the targets. And that's what's going on. You're going to see a lot more pressure to report attacks to the federal government. And by that, I mean, this is not the required disclosure under a state privacy breach disclosure law. You still have those. And if you have a privacy breach, you're going to have to disclose it. But what the Biden administration wants is more disclosure of something like a ransomware attack. Under the law, technically, you might not have to disclose that you've had that because no privacy breach occurred, no personal records were stolen. The whole point of the attack was that they locked the records up so nobody could get them, including you. And then you had to pay the money. But that sort of thing led to the Colonial Pipelines disaster 6 weeks ago. And that is what the Biden administration is trying to prevent. So they're going to have more disclosure requirements of government contractors when they experience more types of cybersecurity breaches. And that's going to go into the government contracts. And then you're going to have to assure the same level of disclosure from your vendors and their vendors and so forth and so on. And then the other thing that I think is very interesting with the Biden executive order in particular is more cooperation on investigations. And you're going to have to think through, well, what does that mean? I have experienced a breach. I've experienced an attack. I've told the government agency where I have a contract with them. Okay, they're going to expect that you cooperate with them in an investigation into the forensics of how this happened. Or am I going to wind up being, called to offer testimony in a criminal trial if the hackers get indicted by the Justice Department? Am I going to get a call from the National Security Division of the Justice Department? Is that what we mean? Yes, to all of it. That is apparently where we are drifting toward. Now, what I will say, and I'm going to make this point a couple of times throughout the hour, is look at what we're talking about here. Oversight of third parties, voluntary disclosure of an incident to the government, cooperation with investigators. That's an FCPA compliance program. That is what we have done in the FCPA compliance world for many years now. That's the message we have been hammered over the head with from the Justice Department. They want you to self-disclose. They want you to oversee the third parties. They want you to cooperate with investigations. It's the same sort of skills, the same sort of basic requirements and fundamentals are applied to cybersecurity. So even though we might get into some technical stuff and some jargon that might sound a bit intimidating today, and I'll try to avoid that, but it might happen, always keep in mind, your company, you have been here before. You have done these things already with other issues. So that is something that we're going to need to always keep as a fixed point in our head as we think about cybersecurity. So a bit more on the Biden order. I probably got ahead of myself here. You're going to need to look at issues like technical capabilities for your ability to detect attacks, ability to store data, ability to prepare to give them information when you have an attack. You'll need to think through, as I said, what would happen if you give all of this data to the Justice Department and they're going to launch an investigation. For example, you might have a ransomware attack that somehow also involves customer data, and you're going to turn over a lot of that information to the feds, because that's the requirement. If you're a government contractor, it's going to be in the contract, probably from, I would say, next year on. Well, if you're disclosing personal data of your customers as part of that package you're giving to the feds, you need to think through, do I have privacy obligations that we're going to need to think about? Do I need to encrypt personal data that might be part of the information I'm going to give to the feds to get to the bottom of this attack? Yes, you would need to think about that. And that is, in fact, a point that the executive order specifically mentions. A lot of it is somewhat vague, somewhat is directing several government agencies to come back with more specific proposals in a couple of months. But it does specifically say you'll need to think through protections of customer data or personal employee data as you cooperate with the Justice Department and collect evidence for whatever attack you suffered. For all of this, however, I think we need to keep in mind a couple of other practical issues. If you pay ransomware, could your company then face penalties yourself? Yes, you could. And the Justice Department has already said that. Say you pay ransomware to release your data, but it ultimately goes to North Korea or Iran. Have you committed sanctions violations? Potentially, yes, you could. I personally do not know how big of an appetite the Justice Department has for enforcing that, but they have already said that they're aware that that could happen and that they might wind up taking an action against company under certain circumstances. Or if your ransomware goes to fund terrorism, you could get a call from the National Security Division, and I suspect that would probably be a difficult conversation to have. All that said, I don't have any good advice to give anybody on this call, should you pay ransomware or not. It's a very difficult decision. Say you're in healthcare and they have locked up life-saving or critical equipment that no longer works. You should have screened your equipment beforehand, but for whatever reason you didn't. Are you now going to stand on principle and not pay ransom while patients in your hospital system are suffering because your medical equipment is locked up? That's a tough call. And I could certainly see a company getting over themselves and saying, screw it, we're going to pay the ransom, which is what Colonial did, which is what, I don't even remember who the other one was, JBS, the meatpacking company, where they were affected by ransomware shortly after Colonial Pipeline. And they also paid a ransom, millions of dollars. And I can see the logic there. But you're going to have to think through, what is our policy about this? And that's probably a decision that needs to be made at the highest level of the company. And then lastly, the last thing I want to talk about with the Biden executive order is third-party oversight. Talk to your IT department or your tech development people about how much software code they use that comes from a third party. And where does that come from? Sometimes a company has no idea where their developers got third-party code. Sometimes they share it among themselves on open source websites. And the Biden order wants to crack down on that. You will need to ascertain the provenance of third-party code. That is how the phrase that the order uses. So if you pull some open source software code off of the web because it's free to put in your product that you then sell to customers, you would have to assess the security of that. This is not a hypothetical. If anybody was caught up in the Equifax breach of 2017, which was 130 million Americans, I think, who had suffered a breach of their credit reports with Equifax, that happened because the IT people at Equifax used open source software code to build a critical part of their software infrastructure, and that had a flaw in it. And that was how the hackers got into Equifax, was through the flaw of the software they had grabbed from online. And you're going to have to be thinking more about what's our policy for using third-party software code? How do we enforce that as a business? How do we enforce that on our developers? What if our developers are contract? How do we make sure that the third parties we use are not using third-party code from somebody else? What are the internal controls we'll have? Who's going to test that internal control material? And so forth and so on. So you can see this very quickly gets to be a technical issue that is one part cybersecurity, it's one part internal control and internal audit. A lot of it is going to be contracting language, and that strikes me as something for legal and compliance to think about. So we have a lot of issues there, and that's just with the Biden cybersecurity order. I wanted to talk a bit about CMMC for all the defense contractors who may or may not be on this call. As I said, CMMC is going to get phased in from today through the next 5 years. Big defense contractors are already going through this. Eventually, it's going to apply to everybody, and it is going to require you to push your cybersecurity assurance down through your supply chain. How this will work at a technical level is there are 5 levels of compliance, and lowest level is level 1 if you are delivering vending machines to Fort Hood. Supposed all the way up to level 5, you're Raytheon developing the next generation of missile guidance systems. High cybersecurity clearance and concerns there. So you, the business, you need to figure out what is our CMMC level that we should try to achieve. And you're going to have to think through, well, what's our business objective as we bid on defense contracts? If we're just delivering foodstuffs, we're never going to need to be level 5. We don't need to be over compliant because that is an onerous process for level 5. You would need to be maybe level 1 or level 2 compliant. So you need to start thinking through, what contracts would we ever want to bid on? Why would we want to do that? What would the security compliance implications be for our business? And then how would we implement those? You would actually need to implement, as I said, here's NIST again in that 4th bullet point. They have a standard now for defense contracting, which is 800-171. The higher your level, the more controls from 171 you're going to need to attest to and make sure that your vendors and your suppliers are also on board with this. You have to undergo an independent audit. But a big part of compliance with CMMC is going to be just understanding, why are we working with defense contracts? Like, what is our business objective? What is our priority here? Will we ever bid on more complex projects in the future where we shouldn't be level 1 or 2? We should be level 3 or 4. And we need to think about that today to make sure that we can achieve compliance with level 4 in 2023. You're going to have to think that through. You're going to have to think about what confidential, unclassified information. So that's personnel records, that's federal contracting information and whatnot. What sensitive but unclassified information are we going to possess as a defense contractor? How are we going to use it? Are we going to give it off to a third-party data storage vendor, because then we have to look at them too. You're going to have to think about what sensitive information you have. Where does it flow through your company on a regular basis? Who's going to touch that? And a lot of businesses still struggle on this point. A lot of them don't even know how many third parties we have that are touching our confidential data. Never mind, have we inspected them? Have we audited their cybersecurity? Have we included in the contract a clause that we can do that? All of these things are going to become much more important for defense contractors. And by 2026, if you don't achieve CMMC compliance, you will be ineligible to bid on a defense contract. So there's a lot of issues here, and I've only quoted 2 relevant ones right now, but we've got a lot of other ground to cover. But just to give you a flavor of what is coming for cybersecurity compliance, the federal government is going to drive a lot of it through the contracting process, and a lot of businesses are government contractors. I did want to talk a bit about the SolarWinds attack as well, because it is so interesting and so emblematic of what is driving us all crazy. So SolarWinds, in case you have blotted this out from your memory, or maybe it glossed over when it happened last year, this was a terrible cyber attack. This was an enormous national security failure for the federal government. SolarWinds itself is a tech company in Texas, where it sells software to help other large organizations manage their IT resources. And in March 2020, a Russian hacking group known as GHBER, that's their real name, but they are very clearly a front for Russian intelligence services, they hacked into SolarWinds and they planted spyware into SolarWinds software. And then SolarWinds passed that along to its customers, and they implemented the software update with the infected spyware from SolarWinds, and then Russia had access to the IT systems of those customers. It started in March 2020. It lasted until at least until June of that year. It wasn't discovered until December of that year, when a cybersecurity firm called FireEye, they realized that they had been a victim of the SolarWinds attack. They looked into it. They realized they were not alone. And FireEye was the first one to grasp the magnitude of what had happened here, that a host of large organizations, large businesses, schools, federal government agencies had all been victimized by the Russians, who had used SolarWinds and its software updates. SolarWinds was not the target here. SolarWinds was the attack vector to get to the targets. The targets were all the others who eventually wound up with spyware from Russia on their systems. So this is a visual representation, really, of what had happened. And I thought it might be demonstrative to talk about for a bit. Number one, we had Russia developing its spyware. They had targeted SolarWinds. They knew that SolarWinds would be a good place to start. They had used a flaw that they had found in SolarWinds software code. The Russians, so they installed the spyware in SolarWinds software product known as Orion. And large organizations already use Orion. It's already installed on their systems, and they've been running it for a long while. So from March to June of last year, SolarWinds did what many businesses do, is that they circulated a software upgrade for Orion, and that's how the attack happened. It is not even clear to me today, I haven't seen this, how many businesses were inspecting those software packages, those updates, the patches, how many were inspecting that patch to make sure that the patch wasn't infected. It's entirely possible not many did. I don't do that. I get a little alert from my software vendors on my home Mac that we have an IT upgrade to do, and I get that from the App Store and I implement them. How often do you do that? And do you really know exactly what you're implementing? But nonetheless, that is what the Russians did to infect everybody. And then over in phase 3 there, bang, you're infected. Phase 3 is just a small sample of the number of businesses and organizations that got infected. And so congratulations, you installed an infected patch. You now have Russians on your system. How did this really actually happen? Let me talk a little bit more about that. From a risk management and compliance perspective, several factors collided here to make this attack like a perfect storm of damage. the Russians really had understood their target, corporate America, and its vulnerability. SolarWinds, that was running on so many of their systems. SolarWinds had a good reputation. It was providing mission critical services. Its user base was largely the people at the companies. They were IT administrators who have a lot of discretion to override internal controls, because that's what IT administrators should be able to do. And the last one that is killer is that apparently somebody years earlier had left a backdoor on SolarWinds code. They had left a little secret password they could use to go in and do their own work on it. I've heard allegations that it was a former intern or a former employee, but they found that there was a backdoor and they hacked into it because the password for that backdoor was SolarWinds 123. They didn't even use uppercase letters for solar and wind. And that is how all of this happened. So when you look at the software supply chain, there are a bunch of risks that companies need to consider here. And a lot of it has to do with getting an accurate picture of your third-party tech vendors and the security risks they pose. SolarWinds was highly respected, and I suspect many IT executives at Fortune 500 companies and in the federal government, they probably weren't thinking, I need to inspect every single thing SolarWinds does. I trust these people. That was misplaced. That was a misjudgment. And it points to the importance of ongoing monitoring of your third parties, who they are and how secure they are and what they're doing for your business. And then you have some of the basic block and tackle mistakes, like setting a weak password for a software backdoor, which A, you shouldn't have had the backdoor. B, if you did, you should have used a much harder software password to crack it. But the most important lesson here, I think, is really to understand that this is all about third-party risk. The companies that get hacked by the Russians first are not really the target. They are the vector. You are the target. And vendor risk management is going to be how you prevent this from happening to you. Now, that is more like a process level question of how do we onboard vendors. There is going to be a entity level way of looking at this. What services do we really want to rely on or are outsourced to tech vendors, and what do we want to keep in-house? And then, there's going to be a host of third-party risk management questions that companies are going to have to think about. It's not going to be about assessing one vendor one time, onboarding them, then we're good. It's not going to be that. It's going to be about managing all the vendors all the time. And again, for everybody who's involved in FCPA compliance, that should sound familiar. It's all about who are these agents that we're using? Where did they come from? What are they doing for us? Why are we using them at all? And we decided to use them 4 years ago to do this for us. Now they're doing these many other services. Have we really thought about that and applied new controls to all of those, that third-party relationship? Those FCPA questions, those are all just as relevant for cybersecurity. So a lot of this is going to be putting cybersecurity controls on a vendor, doing that at scale. Putting it on one vendor and assessing one vendor, that could be an IT security thing, but doing it for 10,000 vendors and then 100,000 of their sub-vendors who are your fourth parties, how do we make that work? What are the policies and procedures, and how are we testing this? How are we documenting it? That's much more a compliance problem. You're going to work with cybersecurity to figure it out, and you're going to work with internal audit to make sure everything is working as it should. But those are the kind of challenges that I think compliance can play a critical role in. And you're going to have to document and attest to all this as you bid on other government contracts here and there, and probably with other private business partners as well. So let me move quickly here about where you can get some help, and then I think I'll just jump straight to the questions that we might have. I don't want Joya to ring her bell and tell me I have to wrap it up. So NIST, as I said, is a great resource. It publishes all sorts of standards for what companies should do for cybersecurity. A fair bit of them are going to be technical standards, and you can farm that off to internal audit or an IT audit function or cybersecurity. But only a fair bit of those controls are technical. A good chunk of them are also more about business conduct. They're about training. They are about enforcing policy, about documentation of policies and things like that. So there are a lot of these controls that NIST is going to recommend that will wind up becoming a compliance or HR or procurement issue. How are we going to enforce this? And you can think about that a lot. You should get to know NIST because, as I said, the Biden executive order, it talks about NIST and it specifically directs NIST to come up with several standards that are going to be implemented for bidding on government contracts. So eventually, your sales guy who is bidding on the government contract, he's going to say, here's all the requirements we have. And you, the compliance officer, the security officer, the audit team, the procurement team, you're going to be stuck having to put this into practice at your business. And it's going to have NIST standards written all over it. That's what those requirements are going to be. A telling example of what you will probably need to do actually comes from the Government Accountability Office. By coincidence, that is the internal audit wing of the federal government. And by coincidence, in May, they looked at how are federal agencies doing at overseeing cybersecurity in their supply chains. And don't die of shock, but federal agencies were terrible at governing cybersecurity risk in their supply chains. And there was a report that measured 23 government agencies. How were they doing against 7 foundational principles that NIST has put out for good cybersecurity supply chain risk? And they were awful at it by and large. A couple were kind of sort of good, but most agencies were not good at all. We had 14 agencies that hadn't done a single thing to meet NIST standards or NIST cybersecurity principles. We had 6 or 7 who had kind of sort of invested in 1 or 2 of these principles. Graphically, it looks like this. The more white you see on that image, the fewer businesses or agencies were actually implementing the practices. I won't go into all of it here in the interest of time, but what's most alarming to me is that none of these federal agencies had implemented a full risk assessment process for cybersecurity of their suppliers. So, okay, 6 out of the 23, they'd implemented a good onboarding process. That's fine. I'm not quite sure how that works if you have an onboarding process, but you haven't really done a risk assessment yet to make sure that you're onboarding for the right things. Even if they onboard one vendor well, they also are coming up short on how do we communicate our expectations to vendors. And a lot of that is going to wind up being the same sort of dance that you will have to do with your vendors. These are the NIST 7 foundational principles. I am not going to go through them all right here, but I would just say, take a look at them and see what they are. They're talking about executive oversight. They're talking about an agency-wide management process and risk assessment. They're looking at how do you actually conduct a review of a specific party? How are you developing requirements for your suppliers? And this is all about cybersecurity, but all of these principles, that's an anti-corruption due diligence program. That could be a money laundering or know your customer due diligence program. All of the compliance steps that you would need to take for cybersecurity in your supply chain, as outlined by these 7 bullet points from NIST. It's all stuff that you have done before, at least conceptually. So the way I like to say it is that, you know, there may be some jargon involved right here, but this is just a new flourish on the dance move. But the dance is a done that compliance, the dance itself is something that compliance officers have done before. So there's a lot of expertise and muscle memory compliance can offer that I think you can apply to cybersecurity. Many of the other business functions are going to come to you soon and say, we have these issues, we have to figure it out. And then the last point that I will bring up before we get to Q&A, and then maybe I can just shoot the breeze and riff on cybersecurity all day long, if you let me. Think about these agencies. And the reason I brought up these government agencies is that they are ultimately going to be your customers. And a lot of what they are struggling with right now, they're going to try to address through the tech vendors that they are using. Well, the tech vendors they're using could be you, or they could be your customer because you are a supplier to a tech vendor. So all of the weaknesses that they had here, where's our image? Those weaknesses are what they're going to try to address. So look at that GAO report, look at these weaknesses and start to think about how could we address those pain points to be sure that when the federal agencies ask us about it, we are in position to be able to give good answers. And that's where ultimately, maybe I'll end on this, is that cybersecurity, like I said at the beginning, cybersecurity is not going to be something for the IT security department and the CISO alone. There is a strong business imperative now for your whole organization to get all of your cybersecurity ducks in a row, all across the whole enterprise, because that is what the federal government is going to want from its suppliers or the sub-suppliers, which could be you, or a lot of Fortune 500 companies are going to take their lead from the federal government anyways and say, we have to do the same sort of a thing. And really, this is my law of third-party risk and compliance, is the better you manage your third-party risks, the better a third party you will be to your customer base. Because the more you manage your third parties, they are your customers' fourth parties. And you all know as well as I do, it's the fourth parties that drive you crazy because you don't know who they are. And if you had the choice between two vendors, one of whom could give you clear assurances that we already have your fourth party risk under control because it's their third parties, and the other one can't do that, you're going to go with the first one. So are the federal government agencies. So are the Fortune 500. So are all of your customers. We are all somebody else's third party. And that's the sort of issue that we need to think about. Let's see. I will skip through a couple of the more audit-centric stuff just to say, here's my final takeaways, that this is going to be a big deal. It already is a big deal in the boardroom to think about cybersecurity, but it's always been much more reactive, that we don't, we're going to respond to the breach. We're going to respond to the ransomware attack. The Biden administration is trying to flip that around. So it is much more proactive, as much as I don't like that word, that you're going to be in a good risk-aware, security-aware posture. That's what the board will want. And that's going to be good business for you. The rest of it, I will leave for maybe later because I know we have a couple of questions. I have some articles that we could use here, that you could use for easy reading if you'd like, things I've written about on the blog. And other than that, that is what I had. Now I'm going to see if I can pull up the questions here. Where are they?
Great job, Matt. Thank you very much. The questions are down at the bottom, and I can read them off to you if you'd like.
If you don't mind, John, that would be helpful for me, yeah.
All right, great. The first question we have here, and you kind of touched on this through your presentation, this was early on, but do you see a lot of compliance teams owning this risk? And more often, does it fall in the hands of the IT team? What is the best practice for an organization? And is there guidance available for handling appropriate at the corporate level?
There's a lot of guidance, a lot of frameworks out there about how to handle this at the corporate level. I can name some of the frameworks, would be, say, COSO. COSO has internal control frameworks that would be relevant here. COBIT, which is specifically for IT controls, that addresses the point. NIST, as I said, they have some frameworks, they have standards that address it. But to your first part of your question, is this something that compliance teams own or that IT risk owns? For a long time, I would say each function has owned different types of that risk. So it's easy to say who owns privacy compliance. Well, the compliance team probably does, or maybe a chief privacy officer if your firm is large enough. But really what you're trying to do is you're trying to meet the standards of privacy laws and regulations around the world. So that's a compliance thing. Whereas meanwhile, the IT department down the hall, they had been thinking more in terms of firewalls to keep the hackers out, or how to do penetration testing to make sure that we have the right access controls in place. And they sort of operated in parallel. And I think, the bigger question is just, that's not going to be sustainable for much longer, I don't think. So who should own this? If I can evade your question by saying everybody should own a little piece of it, and they should work very closely to make sure that they all understand who is owning which part of cybersecurity. That's going to have to be the standard. I recently had a post where I was talking with an IT vendor who said it's easier to manage or to solve for the regulatory compliance problem. It's harder to solve for the cybersecurity because we don't know what is the best amount of cybersecurity for a threat that exists beyond regulation. And, okay, so there is no regulation that says you can't have a ransomware attack. That's not against the law to fall victim to it. But clearly there's a business imperative. You don't want to fall for a ransomware attack. So what's the right amount of cybersecurity to address that point? And nobody can really answer that until you find out painfully that you didn't have enough. It's harder to solve for cybersecurity, but that is becoming a bigger and bigger threat. So I don't know that there is a good, easy answer, except to say you will need a good collaborative approach where everybody is communicating closely about who is doing what to address what I'll say is the hard cybersecurity, the unregulated cybersecurity, the ransomware attacks, the hackers, the Russian bear out there trying to take over your system, versus the regulatory part of it, which is we have met the terms of the contract, we are meeting privacy regulations, we have implemented the correct NIST standard and passed the audit, so we've CMMC compliance is all lined up. There's not going to be a good answer for that yet. Maybe in 10 years we'll have a better answer for it, but right now this still is going to be a team approach.
Sounds good. Yeah, working together is going to be the imperative, I guess. The next question asks about the challenges with remote workforce and the increase that we're seeing in that area, based, I guess, from over the last year with COVID. And how that will impact an organization and impact their approach to this.
So on a very practical level, a lot of fraud. I just wrote about that just yesterday, that the fraud examiners of the world, they are having their grand annual conference right now, and they put out a special report yesterday that fraud had increased a lot, and it was largely driven by work from home, where you have less control over exactly who is accessing your systems. You need to think through how to secure VPNs or how to secure a personal laptop somebody might be using with company apps. So there's that. But I would say fundamentally, working from home is going to it's going to drive up the emphasis for good conduct. A lot of your risks will be less controllable. Unless you want to implement draconian IT security standards, such as using multi-factor authentication for everything, and the employee can't, they have to enter a code that goes to their phone and they enter in their email address. We've all done that for banking from time to time, or from other apps that we might use. Unless you want to do that all the time, which sounds like a terrible way to do remote working, the company will have to think more about emphasizing cybersecurity awareness training. It will have to do more about data mapping and technical issues. It's going to be more challenging, I think, now, because we're going to be kind of sort of back in the office, or some people are back and some people aren't, and some people are in 3 days, but then they're out for 2, and maybe by 2025 we'll all be back. So there will be a lot for your IT team to look at from a technical perspective, mapping out who's accessing what through what networks, and are access and security controls in place. There's still going to be a role for compliance and HR to think through that. We have to communicate to employees. They really are going to be the first line of defense. If they choose to ignore a lot of cybersecurity controls and policies, they'll probably be able to do it, because you can't really control them that well because they're not in the office. And that's going to drive up the need for training, executive communications, disciplinary policies, maybe attestations from employees about what they're doing, things like that. It's going to be a challenging time.
Great. Okay, and our last question, with regards to onboarding and contracting and monitoring, are there three specific processes or tools that would be a starting point for a company to determine where they are and what they need to do?
Well, are there some free tools out there? Yes. There's a reason they're free, and they're not necessarily bad, but I think they would involve a lot of manual work. And the part of my presentation that I had glossed over, because it's more for internal auditors, addresses that, is that a lot of what you will need to do to assess your position right now and figure out what are the gaps that we have and how are we going to remediate and how will we assure that we have put those remediation steps in place. That is a pretty tall order for GRC technology. Could you do it by spreadsheets? Sure. Which circle of hell would that be? In my opinion, I'm not really sure, but I think it would be pretty low. And I've read Dante several times, and this sounds like it belongs on a very low level of hell, because there would be an enormous amount of work that you'd need to do this manually. You can rely on some frameworks, and COSO, COBIT, the NIST framework is out there. There are the numerous NIST standards, depending on exactly what you want to do. And those are great frameworks, but then comes the challenge of mapping its requirements to your current controls, see where they do overlap and where they don't, and then how do you assure that you are sealing those gaps in a timely manner? Like I said, you can try it with email and spreadsheets. I really don't see how that's going to be feasible for a larger business, and you will need to use some sort of GRC tool. I'm not going to recommend any here. Drop me an email or something, and maybe I'll tell you behind the scenes, but I do know that there are numerous GRC software companies that will be happy to have a sales consultation with you. They do see this as a big need, and they're right, because it's a big need. That's what I would say there. You could probably do some very rudimentary understanding of which end is up and how you're going to have to do it with free tools. But you will very quickly, if you are an appreciable company of any appreciable size, very quickly you're going to realize you're going to need a dedicated GRC technology to do this.
Excellent. Now, it's a complex issue and it requires some balance. Matt, thank you very much. That concludes the questions that we have. If anyone else has any Q&A questions, we have a little bit of time, but if there are no others, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Joya, and we will finish up with her concluding remarks. Thank you again, Matt. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully next year we can have you here in person.
Well, thank you all very much. If you had other questions later on, you can always drop me an email, but it's been a pleasure talking with you all. I hope it was useful.
Thank you, Matt.
Yes, thank you again to our speaker, Matt Kelly, for such an insightful webinar today. I'd also like to thank Integrity Risk International for sponsoring our workshop platform this week. And of course, thank you to the GHBER board members. The recording and the slides will be posted on the GHBER website by next week. Texas Bar CLE hours have been approved. 1 hour CLE each day, with the Friday webinar being approved as an ethics hour. The course information is posted on our website. You will have to report your own, as GHBER does not report hours to the bar for any of its attendees. We hope you can join us tomorrow. Our webinar is called The Value of Aligning Corporate ESG and Compliance. Our speaker will be Mike Monroe. So if you have not already registered, please do so on the GHBER website. Also, remember to register for the networking dinner at Good Company Seafood, the Memorial City location, on Wednesday evening starting at 6:30. That registration link is also on the GHBER website. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. Make it a great day. Goodbye.